The evening was grand, the kind of evening that only the wealthiest families could imagine. Golden lights shimmered across the ballroom, crystal chandeliers sparkled like stars, and the floor gleamed with marble polished so perfectly that guests could see their own reflections. Musicians played soft classical music in the background, and servers walked gracefully offering drinks and trays of delicacies. Everyone who entered the hall felt the weight of wealth and power, for this was the home of one of the richest men in the country, a man whose fortune was spoken of with awe and curiosity. He was a billionaire. People knew him not only for his empire of industries and investments, but also for his sharp mind and iron discipline. For years he had been a symbol of ambition, success, and determination. Many admired him, many envied him, but very few truly understood him. He was a man who believed that life was not only about money but about values. And he feared one thing more than failure itself, that his only son, the heir to his empire, might grow up spoiled, shallow, and blind to what truly mattered. This fear had been with him since the day the boy was born. Unlike many wealthy fathers who handed everything to their children, he had raised his son with rules, boundaries, and lessons. He wanted his son to understand hard work, humility, and respect for people of every background. Yet as the boy grew older, the father wondered if his teachings were truly sinking in. Was his son learning, or was he just nodding along to please him? Tonight the father was ready to test him. The hall was not filled only with businessmen and partners. On this particular evening, rows of stunning women stood elegantly in designer dresses. They were models, each of them tall, graceful, and breathtaking. Their presence in the hall was not by chance. The billionaire had personally arranged their arrival. They came expecting an opportunity, for rumors had already spread that something unusual was about to happen. Some whispered that the billionaire was planning to marry again. Others believed it was simply a social gathering, but none of them truly knew the reason. The billionaire stood tall in the center of the hall, his commanding presence enough to silence the crowd without raising his voice. When he spoke, every ear turned to him. His words were steady, calm, and clear, yet they carried a weight that made the atmosphere tense. He looked at his son, a young man just entering adulthood. The boy had grown under the shadow of his father's greatness, always measured by expectations and lessons. He was polite, intelligent, and kind, but tonight would reveal whether his father's efforts had truly shaped him. With a serious expression, the billionaire raised his hand and said, "Tonight I give you a choice. Before you stand women of grace and beauty, each one admired by the world. From them, you may choose the woman who will be your mother. This is your decision, and I will not interfere." The words stunned the guests. A murmur spread across the room, whispers filled with shock and disbelief. Some gasped openly. What kind of test was this? To ask a son to choose his own mother from among strangers? To place such a responsibility on his shoulders in front of an entire gathering? Many thought the billionaire had lost his sense of judgment. But those who knew him well understood that nothing he did was without reason. The models exchanged glances, some smiling with confidence, others adjusting their hair or posture, certain that they would be chosen. They saw the young heir as a path to unimaginable luxury. To be chosen meant a life of wealth and fame, and many of them silently promised themselves that they would win his attention. The boy stood still. His face revealed little, but inside his heart raced. He had not expected this. He looked at the women before him, each one perfect in appearance, each one glowing under the lights. Their beauty was undeniable, but as he stared, something within him felt unsettled. He remembered the lessons his father had repeated countless times. Do not be blinded by appearances. True value is hidden beneath the surface. A heart is worth more than gold. He turned his head slightly and saw at the edge of the hall the household staff. They were standing quietly, as they always did during such gatherings, dressed in their uniforms, carrying trays, refilling glasses, and clearing tables. They were not part of the spotlight. They blended into the background, almost invisible, as if their presence mattered less than the shine of the chandeliers. But to the boy they were not invisible. He had grown up with them. He knew their names, their struggles, their sacrifices. Among them was a woman who caught his eye, though not because of glamour or jewels. She wore a simple uniform, her hair tied neatly, her posture humble but steady. She was the black maid who had worked in the mansion since before he could remember. She was the one who had cared for him when he was sick as a child, who had comforted him when he cried, who had spoken kind words when he doubted himself. She had never tried to impress him, never asked for anything. She had only given him warmth and kindness, treating him not as the son of a billionaire but as a child who needed love. His heart stirred as memories rushed back. He remembered scraping his knee as a boy, and how she had cleaned the wound with gentle hands. He remembered sitting with her in the kitchen when he felt lonely, listening to her stories about life, stories filled with wisdom, even though her own life had been filled with struggles. He remembered how she had told him, "You are not greater because of wealth. You are greater because of how you treat others." The boy looked back at the line of models. Their eyes sparkled with ambition, their smiles practiced to perfection. They wanted the title, the status, the life that came with being chosen. But when he compared them to the maid, he saw the difference clearly. The models wanted him for what he had. The maid had loved him for who he was. The billionaire watched his son carefully. His expression revealed nothing, but inside he waited with deep curiosity. Would his son be like so many others, blinded by beauty and glitter? Or would he remember the lessons he had been taught since childhood? The boy's chest tightened. The entire hall waited in silence. Every eye was on him. Every heartbeat echoed louder in his ears. He knew that his choice would shock the crowd, but he also knew it was the right choice. Slowly he lifted his hand. He did not point to the line of models. Instead, he turned toward the staff at the edge of the room. Gasps filled the air. Whispers spread like wildfire. The boy's hand pointed directly at the maid. His voice, though calm, carried clearly across the hall as he said, "I choose her." The room froze. The models stared in disbelief, unable to accept that all their beauty had been ignored. Guests exchanged shocked glances, unable to understand what had just happened. The staff stood motionless, their eyes wide with surprise. And the maid herself trembled, her tray nearly slipping from her hands. She could not believe what she had just heard. The billionaire's face remained unreadable. For a moment, the silence was so heavy it felt as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Everyone waited for the father's response. Would he laugh? Would he scold his son for making such a choice? Or would he honor his words? The boy stood tall, his heart steady now. He knew the world might not understand. But he also knew this. Wealth could buy beauty, but it could never buy love, loyalty, or kindness. He had chosen not with his eyes, but with his heart. And in that moment, though the world around him buzzed with shock, he felt a quiet certainty that his choice would change everything. The boy's choice had left the entire room in stunned silence. But for him, it was not a sudden decision. It was a choice shaped by years of memories, by lessons he had learned not in classrooms or business meetings, but in the quiet corners of his childhood. To understand why he raised his hand and pointed to the maid, one had to go back to the days when he was much smaller, when the weight of wealth and the gaze of the world had not yet rested on his shoulders. From the moment he was born, his father had known that money could be both a blessing and a curse. The billionaire himself had risen from poverty, a man who once walked barefoot on dusty streets, who had tasted hunger, who had worked with his own hands before wealth found its way into his life. He remembered what it meant to struggle, and he carried those memories like scars that never faded. Because of that, he refused to let his son grow up thinking life was only made of silk sheets and golden plates. He wanted his boy to see life as it truly was in all its shapes, both harsh and kind. The household was large, filled with servants who kept the mansion spotless and grand, but the billionaire insisted that his son spend time with them. While other rich children were sent away with nannies who spoiled them, he told his boy to sit in the kitchen with the staff, to eat the same food they ate, to listen when they spoke. If you want to lead one day, his father told him, you must first understand those who serve. It was in those moments that the boy came to know the maid. She was not young like the glamorous women who now filled the ballroom. She carried herself with dignity, but her hands bore the signs of endless work. Her palms were rough from scrubbing floors, her back often ached from long hours, yet she never once complained. She spoke softly, worked quietly, and treated everyone with kindness. For the boy, she became more than just another worker in the mansion. She became a figure of comfort, a quiet presence who made the cold marble hallways feel like home. He remembered clearly one evening when he was no more than 7 years old. He had been playing in the garden, chasing after a ball, when he tripped and scraped his knee badly on the gravel path. His cries had echoed through the yard, but no one came running from the grand rooms of the house. It was she who rushed to him, kneeling on the ground, lifting him gently as though he were her own child. She carried him to the kitchen, cleaned the wound with care, and whispered softly, "It will heal. You are stronger than you know." That night, as he sat at the servants' table with her, she told him stories of her own childhood, of days filled with hardship, but also of lessons about resilience. He listened wide-eyed, realizing for the first time that people could live lives so different from his, yet still hold so much strength in their hearts. Over the years, she became his quiet teacher in ways that books could not. While his tutors spoke of mathematics and history, she spoke of dignity, of honesty, of treating people as equals. She reminded him often, "A person's worth is not measured by the clothes they wear or the coins in their pocket. It is measured by their heart." The boy carried those words with him even when the world around him seemed to say the opposite. The other staff in the mansion admired her too. She was the one they turned to when arguments broke out, the one who calmed tempers and reminded everyone of patience. She never raised her voice, but her presence was enough to bring peace. The boy saw how others respected her, even though society often overlooked people like her. That respect came not from wealth, but from character, and it left a deep impression on him. As he grew older, he noticed the difference between the world inside the mansion and the world outside. When he attended events with his father, people treated him differently, bowing to his family name, flattering him because of the fortune he would one day inherit. Their smiles often felt false, their words rehearsed. He could see through them even as a child. But when he sat in the kitchen beside the maid, eating simple meals of bread and soup, he felt something genuine. She never flattered him, never treated him like he was special. To her, he was just a boy in need of guidance, and that was exactly what he needed. One day, when he was about 10, he asked her a question that had been troubling him. "Why do people always smile at me differently than they smile at others?" She looked at him thoughtfully and replied, "Because they see your father's wealth, not you. Some people will always see what they want to gain, not who you are. That is why you must learn to look deeper. You must see people not with your eyes, but with your heart." Those words stayed with him, carved into his memory as though they were written in stone. The boy also witnessed the struggles she carried silently. There were days when she looked tired, her steps slower than usual. He once overheard her speaking quietly with another maid about sending money home to her family, about sacrifices she made so her children could go to school in another town. She worked long hours, yet her dreams were never for herself but for those she loved. That selflessness touched him in ways he could not explain. It was because of all these moments, these quiet lessons, that when he stood in the ballroom surrounded by models and bright lights, his heart already knew the truth. Those women were beautiful, yes, but their beauty was painted on the surface. They did not know his struggles, his fears, his childhood tears. They had not carried him when he was small, had not spoken words that shaped the way he saw the world. They looked at him and saw a billionaire's son. She looked at him and saw only a boy who needed kindness. Even now, as he stood under the weight of the crowd's eyes, he could hear her voice in his memory, telling him that character mattered more than anything else. He realized that all the lessons his father had drilled into him about humility and respect had taken root because she had watered those seeds with her quiet example. She had been the living proof of what his father had preached. And so, when he lifted his hand to point at her, it was not a moment of confusion or rebellion. It was the natural result of a lifetime of silent teaching, of the deep gratitude and love he carried in his heart. The models with their glittering dresses might have been what the world expected him to choose, but he knew that the world's expectations were shallow. His choice was not for appearances. It was for truth. The guests in the ballroom could not understand the history that tied the boy to the maid. To them it looked absurd, even shocking, but to him it was the only choice that made sense. And as the silence stretched across the hall, as whispers spread like waves, the boy's heart beat with certainty. He had chosen the one person who had shown him the meaning of love without ever asking for anything in return. In that moment, as the billionaire's eyes studied his son, the boy knew this was more than just a test of wealth or family. It was a test of his soul. The ballroom had never been so silent. The boy's words still hung in the air like a bell that had been struck, and the sound of it seemed to echo endlessly. "I choose her." Those three simple words had shaken the ground of wealth, beauty, and expectation. The guests did not know how to react. Some covered their mouths in shock. Others whispered furiously to the person beside them. The models who had entered the room with so much confidence now stood frozen, their painted smiles fading into disbelief. Their eyes darted to one another, searching for explanations, but there were none. A boy of privilege, surrounded by glittering choices, had looked past them all and pointed to a woman who stood in the shadows. The maid herself could barely breathe. Her heart pounded so hard she thought everyone in the room could hear it. She clutched the tray in her hands, her knuckles white, unsure whether to step forward or to disappear into the crowd. Her life had been built on service, on silence, on staying in the background. She had spent years making herself small, so as not to be noticed in the grand halls of the mansion. And now suddenly all eyes were on her. It felt impossible. She was not dressed in silks or jewels. She did not carry herself with the polished grace of the models. She wore only the plain uniform of her duty. Yet somehow the heir to a billion-dollar empire had chosen her above them all. The boy's father did not move at first. His face remained unreadable, though his sharp eyes never left his son. The billionaire had orchestrated this moment, and now he watched to see what truth would unfold. The silence was unbearable, stretching so long that some began to shift nervously. Then slowly the models began to speak. "This is ridiculous," one of them whispered, her voice edged with anger. Another laughed bitterly, shaking her head as though the whole event was a cruel joke. "He cannot be serious," another muttered under her breath. A few tried to regain their composure, flashing smiles again as if they could still salvage the situation. But their confidence had cracked. They had come expecting a competition, but they had never imagined they would be invisible in the end. The boy stood firm. He did not look at their anger or their confusion. He kept his eyes on the maid, steady and calm. In his heart he knew there was no turning back. His choice had been made, and though the room might not understand, he would not waver. The billionaire finally rose from his seat, and the weight of his presence filled the room. Every whisper died instantly. He looked first at his son, then at the maid, then at the models who shifted uneasily under his gaze. His voice when he spoke was deep and measured. "You have all witnessed my son's decision," he said. "And though many of you may not understand it, this is not a game. It is not a display for your amusement. It is a lesson." The guests looked at one another, confused. A lesson? What kind of lesson could this be? The billionaire's words cut through their doubts. "I brought you here tonight not for beauty, not for show, but for truth. Too often men with power are blinded by appearances. Too often they chase after faces that please the eye but hold nothing within. I wanted to see if my son had learned what truly matters. Tonight he has answered me." The models lowered their heads, some angry, some embarrassed. A few left the line, their heels clicking sharply against the floor as they stormed toward the exit. Others lingered, unwilling to let go of the chance at wealth, but their expressions betrayed their disappointment. The crowd murmured again, but this time with curiosity rather than judgment. Perhaps there was more to this night than they had realized. The maid's eyes filled with tears she fought hard to hold back. She wanted to speak, to say that she was unworthy of such a choice, but her voice caught in her throat. She had never imagined that she would be placed in such a position. She had come to the mansion each day to work, to earn enough to provide for her family, never asking for recognition. And now suddenly the spotlight burned on her. She felt exposed, vulnerable yet also strangely seen for the first time in her life. The boy took a step forward, his voice steady despite the storm of emotion around him. "I chose her because she has always been there for me. When I was a child, she showed me kindness. She taught me lessons about honesty, about respect, about what it means to care for others. She never looked at me as a future billionaire. She looked at me as a boy who needed guidance. That is something money cannot buy. That is something beauty cannot replace." His words struck the crowd with quiet force. They were not rehearsed, not polished. They came straight from his heart, and because of that, they carried weight. Even those who had doubted began to see the truth in his choice. The models, however, could not bear it. To them it was an insult, a rejection not just of their beauty but of the very value they thought they held. One by one, most of them turned and left, their expensive perfumes lingering in the air like fading illusions. The billionaire nodded slightly, his eyes glinting with something unspoken. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps relief. For years he had worried whether his son would see beyond the surface of the world. And tonight he had his answer. The boy had not failed him. The boy had chosen with his heart. The staff stood in stunned silence, their eyes wide. For them this was unthinkable. They had spent their lives invisible, blending into the background, yet now one of their own had been lifted to the center of attention. Some whispered prayers under their breath, others wept quietly, overwhelmed by what they had witnessed. The maid herself finally found her voice, trembling but strong. I do not know what to say," she whispered. "I am just a servant here. I never expected this." Her eyes turned to the boy and she shook her head slightly. "You honor me too much," but the boy shook his head firmly. "No," he replied. "I honor you just enough, because you deserve to be seen." The billionaire stepped closer then, his tall frame towering above them both. He looked at the maid, his expression unreadable but his tone respectful. "You have done more than serve this household. You have shaped my son in ways no teacher or tutor could. For that you have my gratitude." The hall fell into silence again, but this silence was different. It was not the silence of shock but of reverence, of recognition that something profound had just happened. The boy's choice had overturned the expectations of wealth and society, but it had revealed a truth deeper than any tradition. As the night drew on, the guests departed slowly, still whispering among themselves about the unbelievable turn of events. Some would mock it later, unable to understand. Others would admire it, telling the story as an example of wisdom. But for those who had witnessed it in person, it was a memory that would remain forever etched in their minds. The boy and the maid stood quietly as the last of the guests left. The weight of the evening pressed heavily on them both, but beneath it was something new, something fragile yet powerful. For the first time the maid did not feel invisible, and for the first time the boy felt truly certain of who he was becoming. The billionaire watched them with a rare softness in his eyes. His test had been bold, perhaps even harsh, but it had revealed the truth he needed to see. His son had not chosen wealth, nor beauty, nor status. He had chosen loyalty, kindness, and love. And in that choice lay the hope of a legacy that would last longer than gold or power. The mansion that night was quieter than usual, but the silence was not empty. It was filled with the echo of a choice that had changed everything. And though none of them could yet see where this path would lead, they all knew one thing: life in that house would never be the same again. The days that followed the boy's choice were unlike any other in the mansion. The story of the event spread quickly beyond the walls of the grand ballroom. Guests who had been present could not resist telling others about the shocking moment they had witnessed. Some told the story with admiration, praising the young heir for seeing past beauty and wealth. Others told it with ridicule, mocking the boy for what they considered a foolish decision. But regardless of how they told it, the story grew, echoing through the circles of the rich and powerful. Newspapers caught wind of the whispers, and soon the entire city was alive with the tale of the billionaire's son, who had chosen a maid over models. Inside the mansion, life seemed both the same and entirely different. The routines of work continued. Meals were cooked, floors were polished, gardens were trimmed, but there was a new energy in the air. The staff looked at the maid with awe now, no longer just as one of their own, but as someone who had been lifted into a position none of them had ever imagined. They whispered her name in admiration, wondering what her future might hold. She, however, struggled with the weight of it all. She had never wanted attention, had never asked for recognition. She only wanted to work honestly, to provide for her family, to live a quiet life. Now, suddenly, she was at the center of a story that had become larger than her own life. The boy, on the other hand, felt lighter than he had in years. For the first time, he felt free from the expectations that had always pressed down on him. He had lived in the shadow of his father's fortune, expected to act a certain way, to think a certain way, to one day lead in a world of power and wealth. But in making his choice, he felt that he had finally proven to himself, and to his father, that he was more than just a reflection of money. He had acted from his heart, and that gave him strength. Still, he knew that this was only the beginning. One evening, the billionaire called his son and the maid to his private study. The room was vast, its walls lined with books that spoke of centuries of wisdom and knowledge. The fire crackled gently in the fireplace, filling the air with warmth. The billionaire sat in his leather chair, his sharp eyes studying them both as they entered. The boy stood tall, though he felt nervous under his father's gaze. The maid bowed her head respectfully, clutching her hands together, uncertain of why she had been summoned. The billionaire's voice was calm but firm. "Do you know why I created that test?" he asked his son. The boy nodded slowly. to see if I would choose with my eyes or with my heart. A faint smile touched the billionaire's lips, though it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Yes. I needed to know if you had learned the lessons I have tried to teach you since you were a child. Money can blind men. Beauty can mislead them. But character, loyalty, kindness, these are the treasures that cannot fade. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharpening. You made the right choice, my son. But with that choice comes responsibility. The boy's chest tightened. Responsibility? Yes, his father replied. You have lifted someone from the shadows into the light. The world will judge you, and it will judge her even more harshly. You must stand firm. If your choice was true, you must honor it not only in words, but in action. The boy nodded, his resolve firming with each word. I will, father. The billionaire's eyes shifted to the maid then, and for the first time his tone softened. And you have done something remarkable without even knowing it. You have shaped my son's heart. You gave him the strength to see beyond illusions. For that I owe you a debt no wealth can repay. The maid's eyes filled with tears. She shook her head quickly. Please, sir, I did nothing extraordinary. I only did my duty. No, the billionaire said firmly. You did more than duty. You gave him what even I could not give. A gentleness, a compassion that comes only from a heart that has suffered and still chooses kindness. Do not dismiss the value of that. She lowered her gaze, humbled and overwhelmed. She had never heard words like these spoken to her, not from someone of his power. In her heart she still felt unworthy, but she could not deny the truth in his voice. From that day forward her life began to change. The billionaire insisted she no longer serve at the tables or clean the floors. Instead, he gave her a place of honor in the household. At first she resisted, feeling that she did not belong in such a position, but the boy encouraged her, reminding her of all she had done for him. Slowly, she began to accept that perhaps she was more than she had believed herself to be. The transition was not easy. There were whispers in the city, cruel rumors spread by those who could not stand to see someone of humble birth rise so high. Some mocked her background, others questioned her worth. The models who had been rejected spoke bitterly in interviews, calling the event a farce, accusing the billionaire's son of seeking attention. But none of it mattered to the boy. He stood by his choice firmly, never wavering, never letting the noise of the world shake his conviction. What surprised him most was how his father supported him. The billionaire, who had always been so stern, stood beside his son and defended his decision to anyone who dared question it. My son has chosen with wisdom, he said publicly. And I will always support wisdom over vanity. His words silenced many critics, though not all. But his approval gave his son and the maid the strength to face whatever came their way. Inside the mansion, the boy and the maid spent more time together, not as servant and master, but as two souls bound by respect and gratitude. They walked in the gardens and spoke of life. She told him stories of her childhood, of her struggles, of nights when she went hungry so her younger siblings could eat. He listened with admiration, realizing how much strength it had taken for her to survive and still remain so kind. In turn, he shared his dreams with her, not dreams of money or power, but dreams of becoming a man who could make a difference, a man who could carry his father's legacy with integrity. The bond between them deepened, not in the way the outside world expected, but in a way that was purer, more profound. She became more than a caretaker, more than a teacher. She became the heart of the family, the living reminder that wealth without compassion is empty. And as the days passed, the boy began to see the effect of his choice on others. The staff, once invisible, now felt seen in a new light. They worked with more pride, knowing that their worth was recognized. Guests who visited the mansion treated them with more respect, no longer dismissing them as mere shadows in the background. The maid's presence as a figure of honor lifted them all. Yet beneath the joy there was also tension. The boy knew that not everyone would accept this new reality. Beyond the mansion's gates there were powerful men and women who despised change, who believed that wealth should only mingle with wealth, that status should remain untouched. He knew challenges awaited, and he knew that his father's warning about responsibility would soon prove true. But in his heart he also knew this: he would not regret his choice. Because for the first time in his life he had chosen something real. The mansion's lights burned brightly at night, casting a glow across the city skyline, and inside its walls a quiet revolution was unfolding. The boy, the billionaire, and the maid were bound together now by a choice that had defied expectations. And though the world outside whispered and judged, Within those walls there was a sense of peace, of truth, of something unshakable, and deep inside, the boy understood that his journey was only beginning. The story of the boy's choice did not fade as quickly as many expected. In fact, with each passing day it seemed to grow louder, spreading beyond the city into distant places where people whispered about the billionaire's strange test and the shocking outcome. Newspapers printed bold headlines, television programs debated the decision, and social gatherings buzzed with curiosity. Some praised the boy for his courage and wisdom, calling him a young man with a rare heart. Others mocked him, insisting that he had been foolish, that he had thrown away the chance to align himself with beauty and status. For the maid, it was overwhelming. She had never sought attention, yet now she was the center of it. Inside the mansion, the rhythm of life seemed to change. Where once the staff had kept their heads down and worked quietly, now they carried themselves with a new sense of dignity. They had seen one of their own lifted up, recognized for her character rather than dismissed for her position. It gave them hope that maybe the world could see beyond uniforms and duties. But with hope also came tension. Some feared that this new attention would bring problems. The boy had chosen boldly, but bold choices often stirred storms. The maid herself was torn between gratitude and fear. Every morning when she woke, she felt as though she were walking in a dream she had not chosen. She still wore the same uniform, still did the same work, but the way people looked at her had changed. The staff looked at her with admiration. The boy looked at her with respect. Even the billionaire treated her differently now, speaking to her with a kind of regard that made her heart uneasy. She was not used to such honor. For so long she had been invisible, her value measured only by the tasks she completed. Now suddenly she was seen, and though part of her was grateful, another part of her wondered if she truly belonged in this new light. One evening, she found herself alone in the kitchen, the same place where she had once comforted the boy when he was small. The room was quiet, the fire in the stove casting a gentle glow, the smell of bread baking filling the air. She sat at the wooden table, her hands folded in her lap, her mind heavy with questions. She thought of her family, of the children she supported with her earnings, of the sacrifices she had made to keep them fed and in school. She thought of the years of work, of the days when her back ached so badly she could hardly stand, of the nights when she cried silently from exhaustion, and now, after all of it, she was being lifted into a story far larger than her own. She wondered if she was ready. The boy entered quietly, his footsteps soft against the stone floor. He had always found comfort in the kitchen, the one place in the mansion that felt warm and real. Far away from the polished walls and golden chandeliers, he saw her sitting there lost in thought, and he paused. For a moment he simply watched her, seeing not a servant but the woman who had shaped him. Then he stepped forward and sat across from her. "You are quiet tonight," he said gently. She looked at him, her eyes tired. "I am thinking," she admitted. "About what?" "About all of this," she replied. Her voice trembled slightly. "About what it means. About whether I deserve it." The boy leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You do deserve it. More than anyone else. Do you not see? You have been my teacher, my guide. Without you I would not be who I am." She shook her head. "I am just a maid." "No," he said firmly. "You are not just a maid. You are the reason I chose differently. You showed me what matters. You showed me that kindness is greater than wealth. That love is greater than beauty. That character is greater than status. That is not just anything. That is everything." Her eyes filled with tears and she turned her face away. "But the world will not see it that way. They will judge. They will mock. They already whisper things I do not have the strength to face." The boy reached across the table and gently placed his hand over hers. "Then let them whisper. Let them mock. Their words cannot change the truth. And the truth is this: you matter. You always have. And I will not let anyone make you feel small again." For the first time in many years, she let the tears fall freely. Not tears of sorrow, but tears of release, of being seen, of being valued. She had carried so much weight in silence, and now, at last, someone lifted it from her shoulders. As the days passed, the billionaire continued to watch closely. He saw the way his son stood firm, refusing to bow to the pressure of society. He saw the way the maid struggled with her new place in the world, but also the quiet strength she carried. And he began to feel something he had not felt in years: hope. Hope that his empire would not fall into the hands of a spoiled heir. Hope that his son would lead with wisdom, guided not by vanity but by truth. Yet beyond the walls of the mansion, not everyone shared his hope. In the clubs of the wealthy, men whispered with disdain. "The boy has embarrassed his family," some said. "He has stained the name of his father," others added. The models who had been rejected fed the fire, appearing in interviews to laugh bitterly about the foolish heir who had chosen a servant over beauty. Their words were sharp, meant to wound, but the boy refused to respond. He knew that the more he defended himself, the more fuel he would give them. Instead, he chose silence, letting his actions speak for him. The maid, however, felt the sting of those words more deeply. She heard them in the market when she went to buy food. She saw the looks of judgment in the eyes of strangers. She was not blind to the cruelty of the world, but she carried herself with quiet dignity, the same dignity she had carried all her life. And in time, some people began to see her differently. They began to admire her strength, her humility, her refusal to be broken by the harshness of others. One night, the billionaire gathered his son and the maid again in his study. He spoke not as a man of power, but as a father. "The road you have chosen will not be easy," he said. "But nothing worth having is ever easy. My empire was not built by comfort. It was built by struggle, and so it will be with this choice. The world will resist it. But if you stand firm, if you remain true, you will not only prove them wrong, you will change them." The boy nodded, his resolve stronger than ever. The maid lowered her head, still unsure but beginning to believe. That night, as the firelight flickered across the walls, they all felt something unspoken pass between them. It was not wealth, not power, not even family by blood. It was something deeper, something that bound them together in a way none of them had expected. Respect, loyalty, and love born not of appearances but of truth. And though storms waited on the horizon, the boy knew one thing clearly. He had chosen the right path, and no matter how hard it became, he would walk it without regret. The weeks turned into months, and though the whispers outside the mansion did not stop, the life within its walls began to transform in ways that no one could have predicted. The maid, who for years had quietly worked in the background, slowly grew into a figure of respect. At first, she resisted the changes that came with the boy's choice. She still tried to scrub the floors, still tried to serve food, still tried to keep herself hidden in her familiar duties. But the billionaire would not allow it anymore, nor would the boy. They reminded her gently but firmly that she was no longer to be treated as invisible. She had been chosen, honored, and lifted into a place of dignity. At first, she felt uncomfortable when she sat at the large dining table with the family instead of serving them. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, her eyes lowered as though she were waiting for someone to scold her. But gradually, she began to accept her new place, encouraged by the kindness of the boy who always looked at her with gratitude rather than pity. In those moments, she began to see herself differently, not just as a worker, but as someone who had shaped lives through her quiet strength. The staff, too, found themselves walking taller. They had long been accustomed to being unseen, their names forgotten by guests, their faces blurred into the background. But now, when visitors came to the mansion, they looked at the staff differently. They remembered that one among them had been chosen not for her appearance, but for her character. That shift in perception gave them a pride they had never known before. They worked with greater joy, no longer feeling like shadows in someone else's story. Yet the world outside was not so kind. In the circles of the wealthy, conversations still buzzed with judgment. At parties, people whispered behind glasses of wine, mocking the boy's decision, questioning his father's wisdom, and dismissing the maid as nothing more than an accident of fate. Articles in magazines painted the story with exaggeration, calling it scandalous, calling it a mistake, calling it a fairy tale that would crumble under reality. The models who had once stood proudly in the ballroom continued to give interviews, their words sharp and bitter, their laughter cruel as they spoke about being passed over for a servant. The maid heard these words often. Sometimes she overheard them directly when she went into the city. Sometimes she caught the weight of cruel stares as she walked past. Each time she felt a pang in her chest, a reminder of the gulf between who she had been and who she was being asked to become. But each time she returned to the mansion and found strength again in the boy's unwavering gaze. He never let the outside world shake him. His choice remained firm, and his conviction gave her courage. The billionaire, too, noticed the storm that surrounded them. But unlike others, he did not waver either. He had built his empire against the doubts of countless men, and now he watched proudly as his son faced the same doubts with dignity. One evening, he took his son aside and said, "The world will always resist what it does not understand. When I was young, they laughed at me too. They said I would never rise from poverty, that I was chasing dreams too big for my hands. I proved them wrong not with words but with action. You must do the same." The boy nodded, his resolve stronger than ever. "I will, father." It was not long after that the boy began to take on more responsibilities in his father's businesses. The billionaire knew that the day would come when his son would inherit everything, and he wanted to prepare him for that future. The boy attended meetings, listened to negotiations, and learned the language of power. Yet even in those rooms filled with men in expensive suits, he carried with him the lessons of the maid. While others spoke of profit and status, he asked questions about people, about fairness, about responsibility. Some businessmen rolled their eyes at him, dismissing him as naive, but others listened carefully and saw in him a new kind of leader, one shaped not only by ambition but by compassion. The maid watched all of this quietly, often from the background, her heart swelling with a strange mix of pride and disbelief. She had once bandaged his knees when he was small, had once told him stories by the fire when he felt lonely, and now she was watching him grow into a man who stood tall among giants. It was almost too much to take in, yet it filled her with gratitude that her simple kindness had left such a mark. But the challenges did not stop. One evening at a public event where both the billionaire and his son were present, a wealthy man with a cruel smile approached them. With a mocking tone, he said loudly enough for others to hear, "So, young man, I hear you chose a maid over models. Tell me, was it charity or madness?" Laughter rippled through the crowd, sharp and humiliating. The boy did not flinch. He looked the man directly in the eyes and replied calmly, "Neither. It was wisdom. I chose the one person who has shown me love without asking for anything in return. If that is madness, then I am proud to be mad." The laughter died instantly. The crowd fell silent, stunned by his confidence. Even the cruel man who had spoken had no answer. In that moment, the boy proved that his choice was not weakness but strength, and those who witnessed it would remember it for a long time. The maid, when she heard of it later, wept quietly in her room. Not out of sadness but out of pride. For the first time in her life, she realized that her kindness, her patience, her quiet sacrifices had not been invisible after all. They had shaped a young man who could stand against the world with courage. As months passed, the bond between the three of them, the billionaire, his son, and the maid, grew stronger. The billionaire found himself speaking more openly with her, asking for her thoughts in private moments. At first she hesitated, unsure if her words mattered, but slowly she began to share. To his surprise, her perspective, shaped by years of hardship, often gave him insights he had overlooked. He began to see her not just as the woman who had raised his son with kindness, but as a source of wisdom for himself as well. And so the mansion, once only a symbol of wealth, became something more. It became a place where values mattered more than appearances, where love was measured not by beauty or money but by loyalty and truth. The boy knew there were still battles ahead, that society would not easily accept what they had built. But he also knew this: they had already proven something important. They had shown that one act of courage, one choice of the heart, could begin to change even the hardest of minds. Late one night, as the boy stood on the balcony of the mansion, looking out at the city lights that glittered like stars, he thought of the journey that had brought them here. He thought of the ballroom filled with models, of the silence that followed his words, of the maid's trembling hands, of his father's sharp eyes watching, and he thought of the future still waiting for him, a future filled with challenges but also with hope. Behind him, the maid stepped quietly onto the balcony. She stood beside him, her face calm as she looked out at the same lights. Neither spoke at first, but the silence between them was comfortable, filled with understanding. Finally, she said softly, "The world may never fully accept what you did." He turned to her, his voice steady. "Then I will not ask for their acceptance. I will ask only for their respect. And if they refuse to give it, I will live without it, because I already have what matters." She looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And what is that?" He smiled gently. "You." For a moment she could not answer. She simply stood beside him, the city lights reflecting in her eyes, and in her heart she knew that no matter what storms came, they would face them together. Years passed, and the boy was no longer seen as just the heir to a billionaire's fortune. He had grown into a man who carried himself with dignity and quiet confidence, and people began to see him not only as the son of wealth, but as a leader in his own right. His father gradually stepped back from the empire he had built, placing more responsibility into his son's hands. At first, there were doubts from investors, whispers that the young man was too soft, too compassionate to handle the brutal world of business. But time proved them wrong. The values he had learned from the maid, the lessons about kindness, loyalty, and character, became the foundation of his leadership. He was firm, but never cruel. He sought fairness, but never weakness. And in doing so, he earned the respect of those who once dismissed him. The maid remained by his side through all of it. She was no longer the quiet figure who blended into the background of the mansion. She had become a presence of wisdom and strength in the household. People who once looked down on her began to speak of her with reverence. Visitors to the mansion greeted her with respect, not out of obligation, but because they saw in her something undeniable, a woman whose quiet dignity had shaped the very heart of the family. Yet despite all the honor, she remained humble. She still woke early, still walked the gardens in the mornings, still found peace in the simplest parts of life. Sometimes she laughed softly when she remembered how the world had reacted on that unforgettable night in the ballroom. The shock, the whispers, the disbelief, it all seemed so distant now. What had once been scandal was now a story people told with admiration. It had become a legend, a tale of a boy who had looked past glittering beauty and chosen the one heart that had never failed him. The billionaire, now older and slower in his steps, often watched the two of them with quiet pride. In the evenings, when the house grew still and the city lights flickered in the distance, he would sit in his study and think about the life he had lived. He had built towers of glass and steel, had commanded boardrooms with power, had earned riches beyond imagination. Yet none of it compared to the satisfaction he felt when he looked at his son and the maid. His son had proven himself, not only as a leader but as a man of integrity, and the maid had proven that greatness was not born from wealth but from character. Together they had created something stronger than money, a legacy of truth. One day the boy, now a man, was invited to speak at a gathering of young leaders. The hall was filled with bright faces, eager minds who wanted to know the secret of success. Many expected him to speak of investments, of strategies, of the cleverness that had built his father's empire. But when he stood at the podium, his words surprised them. "When I was a child," he began, his voice calm but steady, "my father taught me that wealth without wisdom is dangerous. He warned me that beauty can deceive, that power can corrupt. But what shaped me most was not the lessons of money or business. It was the kindness of someone who saw me not as a future billionaire, but simply as a boy who needed love. She was a maid in my home, invisible to most, but to me she was the greatest teacher I ever had. She showed me that true worth is not found in appearances or possessions, but in the strength of the heart." The room fell into silence. His words touched them deeply because they were not polished speeches meant to impress. They were truths carved out of his life. And when he finished, there was no applause at first, only the sound of quiet reflection. Then slowly, the hall erupted in admiration, not for his wealth, but for his wisdom. The maid listened to his words later when they were repeated to her, and her eyes filled with tears. She had never imagined that her life, simple and unadorned, would inspire so many. She had spent years believing she was small, unworthy of notice. Yet now her story was shaping the minds of others, guiding them toward a better way of living. For her, that was the greatest gift of all. In time, the boy's story became more than just a family tale. It spread across generations, told and retold as an example of seeing beyond appearances. Teachers shared it in classrooms. Parents told it to their children. Leaders spoke of it in speeches. It became a reminder that greatness is not in the titles people carry, nor in the wealth they hold, but in the choices they make when the world is watching. The mansion itself changed too. Where once it had been a place that symbolized wealth, It became a place that symbolized values. The staff no longer felt like shadows. They were part of the family's story. The walls that had once echoed only with the sounds of business dinners and formal events now echoed with laughter, with conversations about life, with stories that reminded everyone of what truly mattered. The billionaire passed away peacefully years later, leaving behind his empire in the hands of his son. But his final words to him were simple. "You have done what I prayed for. You have chosen not with your eyes, but with your heart. Protect that choice, for it will protect you." Those words stayed with him forever, a guiding light in the years that followed. The maid grew older too, her hair silver, her steps slower, but her spirit remained strong. She never sought fame, never wanted her story to be exaggerated, but no matter how much she tried to stay humble, she could not stop the way people admired her. To many, she became living proof that kindness, even in the smallest acts, could shape destinies. And when she finally closed her eyes for the last time, she did so surrounded by love. The boy, now a man fully grown, held her hand and whispered, "You will always be my true mother." And in that moment he knew that his life, his success, his legacy were not the result of fortune or luck, but the gift of a woman who had once been overlooked by the world, but never overlooked by him. Her story did not end with her passing. It lived on in every decision he made, in every life he touched, in every word he spoke. And as the years rolled on, people continued to tell the story of the boy who had been given a test in a ballroom filled with beauty, and had chosen the one heart that had loved him unconditionally. Generations later, when people asked about the foundation of his empire and the secret to his success, the answer was always the same. It was not in the strategies of business or the cleverness of deals. It was in a single choice, made not with the eyes but with the heart. A choice that proved to the world that true greatness is not measured in wealth or beauty, but in the courage to value what others overlook. And so the story lived on, not just as a tale of a billionaire's son, but as a lesson for everyone who heard it. A lesson that love is greater than appearances, that kindness is stronger than power, and that the simplest hearts often carry the greatest treasures.